All right. So welcome to the first ever the colloquium hosted by the Chunghwa University Center for Cinema and Media Studies. My name is Jiun Kim, the center's director. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Michael Richardson as the center's inaugural event. That's just starting now. And so before the start, I'm going to introduce the speaker. Dr. Michael Richardson is the Associate Professor of Media at the School of the Art of Media at University of New South Wales. Also, the Associate Investigator of AIC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, co-director of Media Future Lab at the university. He has been publishing, various on many articles in top-notch journals, including the radical absence encountering traumatic effect in data-mediated disappearance in cultural studies in 2018, climate trauma or the effects of the catastrophe to come in environmental humanities in 2018, and drone trauma, violent mediation, and remote warfare in media, culture, and society, and the framing data witnessing and air wars and the production of authority in completing monitoring, co-authored as a co-authored paper in media, culture, and society, and as another the very great paper that I wrote, pluralizing the planetary, the radical incompleteness of machine visioning, co-authored by Anna Munster in Media plus Environment in 2023. And the first, he also published it as the first book, Gestures of Testimony, Torture, Trauma, and Affect in Literature by Bloomsbury Academic in 2016. And his latest book is Non-Human Witnessing, What Data in Ecology After the End of the World, which is the topic of today's talk. So please welcome Dr. Michael Richardson.
Thank you so much, Professor Ji-Hun Kim, for that kind introduction and for your generous invitation to speak today. And thank you, everyone, for joining for this talk and the conversation to follow. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully that will work. So in the present moment, we are seeing the Trump White House defund research and attack universities. We've seen the violent destruction of institutions of higher education in Gaza. In Australia, where I work, research funding has stagnated. Researchers are often precariously employed, and even many tenured scholars find it hard or impossible to make time for research. In the UK, universities have fired numerous staff in seemingly endless rounds of funding cuts. In many places in the West, in short, the humanities are under fire, whether from ideologues who resent critique and change, or by technocrats who want universities to do nothing more than supply industry with skilled workers. All of this is to say that the birth of a new research centre dedicated to cinema and media studies is timely indeed. So congratulations, Professor Kim. It's a welcome contribution to the study of our diverse and converging fields that many of us work in and across. And it's something to be celebrated and welcomed. Especially, it seems to me, in South Korea, where from afar it seems that research support remains strong. And Professor Kim tells me that there is growing interest in the non-human and its implications for thought. So it seems to me that this is indeed the right time to be launching a new centre, building on a remarkable history of colloquiums and talks and so on over the last several years. So I'm deeply honoured to be giving this inaugural talk, and I hope that what I have to say does some justice to the moment. So to begin, 3 images. Glass bush plums, capturing breath and registering the atmospherics of nuclear testing on First Nations land. an aerial targeting system designed to use a low-power form of machine learning computation to select imagery for potential analysis by human operators. An object recognition algorithm for spotting tear gas canisters trained on synthetic data. What is shared by the technologies, objects, encounters, and events indexed in these images? My proposition and the argument made in my book, Non-Human Witnessing, is that these are each instances of the non-human bearing witness, instances of the registering of violence that make an ethico-political claim on the human, even as they refuse the constraints of anthropocentric modes of knowing and communicating. So I wanted to say, before I get into things, a little bit about how I came to this project and give some context for the book. So my academic background is in literature studies, but also in the study of international relations and geopolitics. And I arrived at the study of affect and media and technologies through that. And so in the book, I rove across a range of different types of media and art and events and so on that range from individual forms of testimony and experience through different types of artworks to political events to social media and a whole host of other things. The book in this respect speaks to some of the kind of the roving nature of my interests. But those interests have always cohered and centered on questions of testimony, of witnessing, and of trauma, and in particular of the relational modes through which those things come to be. This book itself emerged from a talk that I gave in Berlin almost 10 years ago, and a colleague there who has since become a dear friend, Jonas Benz, said as I spoke about drones and the capacity of drones to bear witness, that, you know, he said, so you could say then perhaps that these drones are non-human witnesses. And that phrase stuck with me for a very long time. And through further work in Berlin and inquiries in the time since, I increasingly became concerned with this question of the non-human and how it might come to matter for witnessing. And to me, this is, as I hope I will elaborate in the talk today, a really fundamental question about how we know and reckon with the world that we're in. Because the book is in many ways an attempt to reckon with the intensifying crises in which we live and the demands they place on how we know and who or what gets to know. So I began writing this book in earnest in 2019 and pursued the bulk of it through the hard years of the pandemic. If the crises to which it is addressed felt urgent 5 years ago, they are now, I think, increasingly existential. Algorithmic takeovers of government, AI as a shield for accountability, autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems more common on the battlefield, global action on climate change floundering. Practices of knowledge-making are themselves now under threat, both because of outside actors, but also because the scale of the challenges we face demand new forms of knowing, and because the existing frameworks that we do have are dissolving in the face of the new pressures being applied to them. So for me, one of the big questions this situation of polycrisis demands of us is to ask, how do we bear witness to it? So this relationship between the human and the witness has concerned me for some time, particularly because it implies the notion that the witness is necessarily human, and commensurately that the human is in part defined by the capacity to witness. That has been, I think, the built-in assumption in the practicing of witnessing over many years, but also, and perhaps through much of history for many cultures, at least, and certainly many Western cultures. But I think it is also something that is implicit in much of the scholarship around witnessing, which assumes that the human is the center of the witness. And if we shift that, if we begin to question that, I think some big political questions flow from it, flow from that rethinking of witnessing. Now, in the talk today, I'm going to try to stay light on citation and quotation and so on. But I always think it's helpful to know where some people's references and points of contact sit. So I will say just briefly that some of the thinkers who have most influenced me on the subject of witnessing itself are the artist Susan Schuppli, Eil Weitzman, who is the founder of forensic architecture, Joseph Pugliese, who is an Australian cultural studies academic, and Kelly Oliver, who has worked in the American psychoanalytic tradition around witnessing and done some very interesting work. My thinking on affect has been profoundly shaped by Brian Masumi and Aaron Manning, as well as by Anna Gibbs and Greg Siegworth. And on war, I'm very indebted to Jerris Grove, Antoine Bousquet, and Nisha Shah, who I think do some of the most interesting radical scholarship on how we theorize war and its role in the world. In much of the work in the book, though, I'm also indebted to thinkers from radical Black and Indigenous traditions, including Sylvia Wynter, Kyle Powys-White, Edouard Glissant, and the Australian Indigenous scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, and many others too. Their work, particularly that work from radical Black and Indigenous traditions, puts tremendous pressure on the concept of the human and the role of epistemologies in the exercise of colonial and capitalist power and the necessary rethinking of subjectivity, relationality, and temporality entailed in reckoning with the crises that we in the West have made for ourselves and the planet. This then is probably an appropriate time to acknowledge, as we do in Australia, that I live and work and wrote this book on the unceded and sovereign lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of Sydney, Australia. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And today I'm mostly going to talk about what we might think of as the colonial present. But I want to recognize too the colonial histories of control and violence, often enacted through mundane practices of mapping and registering lands and peoples, and recognize that is a lot of what sits behind this book. So today I'm going to give an overview of my book, Nonhuman Witnessing, War, Data, and Ecology After the End of the World. And I'm going to give an overview of some of the core concepts and propositions of the book, and then I'm going to illustrate them with 3 instances that traverse its principal domains of war, data, and ecology. And they are the tied to the images that I showed at the very beginning. So our planet is now caught within the surge of multiple unfolding and interlocking crises of increasingly autonomous war, algorithmic enclosure, and ecological catastrophe. All crises rooted deep in the twin historical engines of colonialism and racial capitalism. Advances in machine learning have supercharged both algorithmic enclosure and autonomous warfare. Reliance on mass computing in everything from image recognition to Bitcoin mining has combined with an exponential expansion in digital data stored in servers and trafficked across networks to produce a huge carbon footprint for computation. Built into the bedrock of the civilian internet as the host of everything from ebooks to presidential campaigns to banking, those same infrastructures have a massive environmental impact in heat generated and fossil fuel consumed. Those same fossil fuels, of course, power the energy appetite of the US military, which is the world's largest carbon polluter. So in the most basic sense, these crises of war, data, and climate, and the system of racial capitalism they maintain and depend on, are drawing down the finite resources of the planet. Taken together, they are both product and perpetrator of violence. And we could think of that violence as structural or infrastructural, environmental or military, algorithmic or interpersonal, kinetic or slow. Now, crisis, among many things that it does, it enfolds and consumes events. It entangles bodies, intensifies the contexts of their occurrence, and cuts through forms of connection to impose new disorders. My colleague Andrew Murphy calls this catastrophic multiplicity, quote, a complex storm of feeling, of aspects of world feeling each other in intense, unexpected, and constantly mutating ways. catastrophic multiplicity intensifies, bewilders, and numbs feeling, which makes thinking with and through problems difficult, if not impossible. Crisis doesn't punctuate time so much as shape its passage, lacking any distinct beginning or end, enfolding past or future. Crisis, in other words, is not a singular thing, not a singular event, but rather something that takes hold of the worlds that we occupy. So in the book, the concept of non-human witnessing brings disparate encounters, processes, and scales into conjunction with the relational formation of knowledge and subjectivity. But it does so through committed attention to the processes of mediation that animate and bind together crises of war, data, and climate. For me, then, non-human witnessing describes both a critical concept that we might marshal in our analysis, but also a relational practice, something that exists in the world, a distinct mode of communication, one constituted by an address that demands response, but still embraces and respects opacity. Non-human witnessing is, I think, a transversal opening onto the workings of violence, experiences of precarity, and the shattering of epistemologies. It's an aperture, I think, through which communication might take place in ways that are necessary for care and justice in the aftermath of ended and ending worlds. Now, I think it's worth recognizing at this point that witnessing is fundamental to cultures, communities, and polities because it pushes events onto the stage of justice. It helps determine significance and truth, contributes to the making of shared knowledge, including scientific knowledge, anchors political subjectivity, and produces responsibility. Witnessing forges relations between witness and event, a registering of something happening that forms an address and insists upon a response. Witnessing and testimony are found in different guises in courtrooms, church halls, human rights tribunals, fiction and poetry, media reports, scientific laboratories, and countless other places, perhaps especially so in scholarship. Far from a static concept or enduring set of practices, witnessing itself has transformed throughout Western history. And I say Western history here carefully because the lineage I track very much comes through a kind of Western tradition of thought, and I don't want to step beyond my capacity to speak in doing so. But throughout Western history, it takes on new forms and dynamics alongside and in response to changes in technology, politics, sociality, and religion. So the book asks what happens when the frame of what counts as witnessing expands, how more than human epistemic communities might form, and what this might mean for subjectivity, the nature of justice, and the struggle for more just worlds. So I develop non-human witnessing as a kind of analytical concept that brings non-human entities and phenomena into the space of witnessing and accords them an agency otherwise denied or limited by much witnessing theory to date. So this is in some ways a strategic gesture, one designed to make room for excluded knowledges, subjectivities, and experiences within a wider frame of cosmopolitical justice. The book in many ways has a very ambitious goal, which is to unknot witnessing, weave it anew as inescapably entangled with the non-human, and within the warp and weft of that weaving, find a renewed political potential for witnessing after the end of the world. My kind of gamble is that understanding witnessing as bound up with non-human entities and processes gives us new and perhaps even transformative modes of relating to collective crisis and the role of the human within it. In Western popular culture, and here I feel relatively comfortable in saying Korean popular culture too, or at least many of the films and movies I watch, apocalypse has been in the air and on the screen and on the page. Zombies running amok, asteroid strikes, AI takeovers, bioengineered crashes, alien invasions, and so on and so forth. These might be understood as metaphors of late capitalism or of climate change or of global migration or of technological anxiety or many other things. But I think what we can say for sure is that these end times imaginaries are no longer the preserve of niche subcultures or millenarian religions, but at the heart of the most profitable, most mainstream forms of popular culture. But the estrangement that we feel from these imaginings, the kind of lure of catharsis in the fictional experience of the end of the world, relies on being situated in relation to a very specific telling of history. As the Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White points out, quote, "The hardships many non-Indigenous people dread most of the climate crisis are ones that Indigenous peoples have endured already due to different forms of colonialism, ecosystem collapse, species loss, economic crash, drastic relocation, and cultural disintegration. Now, today, that ending of worlds has come to the world enders, the colonizers and empire builders who imagined into being a singular global world and made it so with the rifle, the slave ship, the ledger, and the plantation. As crises expand, intensify, and intersect, the capacity of witnessing and testimony to respond has been amplified, multiplied, and diversified by the adoption of new and sometimes old technologies, techniques, practices, knowledges, and theories. Open source investigations led by agencies such as Bellingcat, Air Wars, and occasionally Forensic Architecture have shown how crowdsourcing, computational tools, 3D modeling, data analysis, remote sensors, and other technologies and methodologies can be combined with situated testimonies to generate alternative accounts of state and corporate violence. Satellites and drones provide human rights and environmental monitors with rich data that extends and exceeds the perceptual capacity of humans in scale, vantage point, and visibility across a much wider band of the light spectrum. Smartphones and social networks bring a far wider array of voices and images to public attention, shaking the epistemic dominance of traditional media institutions. Cheaper and more accessible sensing technologies have enabled citizen-led projects to monitor local ecologies. Growing recognition within the scientific community about the communicative capacity of plants and ecologies more broadly resonates with the push by First Nations activists to have non-human entities recognized by state law. Artists, poets, activists, and creative practitioners of all stripes now engage with techniques, ecologies, and politics in a testimonial mode that entangles human and non-human actors. In so many contexts, witnessing serves as a socio-technical apparatus that refracts experiment into authority, reportage into truth, science and broadcasting into power. In the 20th century, a shift took place from transcendental knowledge, continuous media, and analog technologies to mathematical grids and models, discrete media, and statistical technologies. Enumeration, probability, and statistical inference and analysis have taken hold, backed by mathematical theories of information and markets. Networked communication applied to a datafied world produced a new kind of observer, one who followed the rules of the cybernetic order, but saw the world through increasingly inhuman modalities of perception. The witness as cyborg, harnessing and harnessed to new technologies of vision, began to shape how data was presented and deployed. But it also signaled a deeper infiltration and extension of human perception and action via machine. This technological transformation laid the foundation for smartphones, drones, remote sensors, and even artificial intelligence to become instruments of witnessing, even as they themselves transform the relationship between witnessing and the ground truth against which it is so often measured. As I conceive it, non-human witnessing is both a particular form of perception and something else besides, a communicative form shaped by the materiality and affectivity of the world as medium, an ethico-political mode of relation for grounding anew how meaning comes to matter in the making and remaking of worlds. Non-human witnessing is not an ahistorical or transcendental concept then, but rather the naming of a set of interconnected practices and processes of witnessing that are bound up with evolving epistemic frameworks and forms of media. It is, in other words, a historically situated notion. So, First instance. Future collapse bears down on wounded ecologies in the present, bringing itself into being through the continuance of violence in the form of trauma. Consider, for instance, the fires that have become the norm in California, Brazil, and Australia, and many other places, of course, and the way their looming ever-presence affects life even beyond the devastating damage to animals, habitats, and homes. There is, in a very real sense, an injury in the now from that which has and yet has not arrived, always in dynamic flux, even if that flux is entropic. The present of an ecology is always missed in much the same way as it is for humans. Or to put this another way, the present is always lost between unfolding pasts, which carry with them lost futures, and also lost in the tug of potential futures. And that is true, I think, in more than human ecologies in the present. They're always unavailable to their own experience. They're always in flux, in transformation. So there is a kind of traumatic relation that operates within ecological crisis that's not simply about the apparent futility of action in this era of late capitalism, but also the exponential complexity of the problem. Ecologies are not isolated systems. Any boundaries placed upon them are always artificial and temporary. Ecologies connect up. They're diverse and multi-layered. It's we humans who draw boundaries around them. We distinguish one ecology from another to make them sensible and addressable, but doing so is always a kind of tactical measure. Ecologies fold into one another, at once one and many. Just minor ecologies connect to larger ones, connect to larger still, connect to planetary and perhaps even interplanetary systems. The ecological traumas that we experience now have thus shaped and continue to shape lives, communities, cultures, and ecologies. Among those traumas is one that resides at the atomic organization of existence, nuclear war. Nuclear explosions occur within a fraction of a second, but they leave radiation that contaminates, mutates, and ends life into unfolding deep time futures. Nuclear weapons and their catastrophic damage constitute a vital site for engagement with non-human witnessing, then, as both an other-than-human registration of change and an aesthetic project of human and more than human commingling. Yankuchichara elder Lester Yami called it, quote, a black mist. Actually, let's leave this one up. A black mist, a thick cloud enveloping Adminithana country, part of a huge swath of Aboriginal land in South Australia, used for nuclear testing by Britain from 1953 to 1963. He described his experience this way, quote, a big bang, a noise like an explosion, and later something come in the air. It was coming from the south, black like smoke. I was thinking it might be a dust storm, but it was quiet, just moving through the trees and above. That again, you know, it was just rolling and moving quietly. Nuclear bombs are designed to explode well above the ground, maximizing both the force and radius of the blast. This is what produces the spectacular mushroom cloud, which reached a height of almost 12 kilometers with the first test at Maralinga. Heat is so intense that it turns bodies to ash, melts metal and concrete, and, at Maralinga and nearby Emu Fields, transformed the silicate and sand of stretches of desert into a crust of glass. Glass becomes an aesthetic medium for the non-human witnessing of nuclear violence in the hands of the artist Ioannis Scarce. Brittle, yet tough, capturing light, yet also diffracting and refracting it. Rigid when cool, yet shaped by the breath of the glassblower when molten. Belonging to the Kakatha and Ngukunu peoples, whose country forms part of the Maralinga exclusion zone where the nuclear testing took place, and born in the military town of Woomera, Scarce's personal and familial history is bound to settler colonialism and to its entanglements with militarism and nuclear testing. Her work is intensely political, an unflinching critique of past and present violence, but also a celebration of the resilience and endurance of Aboriginal people and of country in the face of the colonial logic of elimination. Repeatedly returning to the interconnections between the classification and dispossession of Aboriginal peoples and land, and scientific and military testing, Scarce's work is unified by an unrelenting aesthetic of austere grayscale, battered found objects, stark medical equipment, and spare architectural structures and installations. While Scarce works with a range of media, glassblowing is at the core of her practice, a visceral and difficult art that demands much of breath and body. Thunder Raining Poison and Death Zephyr are formally and thematically similar works. Both are composed of thousands of blown glass yams suspended from the ceiling in arrays that reference the atmospheric forms produced by nuclear tests at Maralinga. Yams, if people aren't familiar, are like a bush sweet potato almost, like a tuberous vegetable. There are critical differences between the two works. Thunder Raining Poison captures the instance of detonation, yams arranged in a teardrop formation. You can see part of that on the screen right now, and mostly made of clear glass interspersed with black and blue. Death Zephyr examines the spread of contaminated particles in the aftermath of the blast. Its mix of black and clear yams hang in a swirling current across the gallery, a material enactment of Lester Yami's black mist spreading over Aboriginal country. Composing yams into forms of nuclear explosion and dispersal materializes the violation of life by such violence, its assault on the non-human that sustains the human. Not only is sand blasted into non-life, these works suggest, but also the means to sustain life, affectively and discursively signified in the alchemy of yams, of these edible potatoes becoming inedible. These are reminders of the limits of the forensic practices of the state to understand the consequences of the tests conducted on Aboriginal land, precisely because life is ecology. Yams, sand, land, bush, animals, people, they're bound together for Indigenous people in Australia by what they call country, a relationality that is just as crucial to the ecology as the electromagnetic forces that hold neutrons in check are to the stability at the atomic scale. Unstable isotopes are radioactive. They contain an unbalanced combination of neutrons and protons in their nucleus, which typically means too many neutrons. By shedding extra energetic particles, these isotopes decay into other particles, becoming more stable and less radioactive, but releasing nuclear radiation in the process. When a nuclear bomb is detonated, radioactive particles are dispersed by the explosive force, attaching themselves in turn to other particles. This is what nuclear fallout is, the irradiated particles of weapon debris and dust that are carried on the wind. As Death Zephyr, the work on the screen, reminds us, before they fall to Earth. In their fall, they can attach and deform more particles and the cells that make up life, such that stones, plants, animals, and people become carriers of contamination, non-human and doomed witnesses to nuclear catastrophe. Through the breath of the glassblower, vitrified silica becomes intimate and lively, a rich ecology of country, life, fruit, vegetable, and yet still an ecology deeply wounded by the violence of war and settlement. Glass yams and bush plums distill the ecological traumas of nuclear testing at Maralinga. The stuff of life rearranged into the mushroom cloud and its dispersal, and memorialized in the tin sheds of the test sites. Life in all its relations, located in country and food, in air and stone and water, is not simply indexed or represented in the art of Ioannis Scarce. It is processually present, materialized as a witnessing ecology come to life, out of the urgent need to witness ecological trauma and its continued entanglement with the settler state and its militarisms. Its capture of breadth, of course, references nuclear histories, but it also orients towards the future presence, towards the present of settler governance and towards the unfolding of history of futurity. Second instance, war and Agile Condor. Agile Condor is an onboard targeting system for military drones developed by the defense firm SRC Inc. in collaboration with the US Air Force Research Laboratory. Built to analyze large quantities of data from the drone's sensor apparatus in real time, Agile Condor is embedded in a pod that can be fitted to the wing of an MQ-9 Reaper, the principal weaponized drone in the United States arsenal. According to its makers, Agile Condor is an artificial intelligence targeting system capable of analyzing video footage, synthetic aperture radar imagery, or infrared camera imagery in order to detect, categorize, prioritize, and track potential targets. It undertakes this image processing autonomously and at the edge of the network. Agile Condor only sends imagery it deems to meet a threshold of value to human analysts. This cuts down latency and it relieves pressure from overstretched military networks, particularly in contested battle spaces. By only delivering sensor data of potential interest, the system also lessens the accelerating need for highly skilled image analysts and allows them to focus on potential targets rather than sift through vast amounts of irrelevant imagery. But for all these claims of efficiency, Agile Condor and technologies like it raise big questions around how and where computational knowledge gets made, and how war can be witnessed in an age of increasingly autonomous weaponry. In turn, this has implications for knowledge making more generally, not least because war, for all its violence, is a creative domain of continual becoming that exerts a remarkable pull on the fabric of cultural and political life, and indeed the project of technoscience more generally. So Agile Condor is worthy of attention because it integrates autonomous perception into an already complex kill chain, inserting a machinic intelligence that preemptively shapes the fields of possibility for human analysts and operators. Agile Condor, I think, constitutes a kind of liminal, non-human witness. It predetermines the meaning and significance of events and objects, presenting them as open to address by the remote warfare system. Through the operative role of its onboard high-performance computer, the AI pod siphons off human agency in the name of efficiency. No longer will human analysts be concerned with discerning the figure of threat against the ground of life, but only with an array of figures presented as actionable. It's a reminder, perhaps, that the perpetrator can also be witness. President of weapons manufacturer General Atomics, David R. Alexander, claims that Agile Condor's, quote, ability to autonomously fuse and interpret sensor data to determine targets of interest is at the forefront of unmanned systems technology, end quote. But this idea of doing computing at the edge is not confined to military operations. In fact, it originates in commercial problems of bandwidth and latency produced by the move toward cloud computing architectures. So against the push to centralize control via the capacity of networks to distribute information, edge computing offers the potential to decentralize control while retaining centralized authority. So in war, this fusion of sensing, classifying, and selecting within black box technologies signals an increasing acceptance of computational agencies on and above the battlefield. It pushes those processes of computation to the edge of the network rather than dragging information back towards the center. Where the military media technologies of the 20th century shaped and were shaped by mass, those of the 21st are devolved, individual, and distributed. According to both its marketing material and various technical papers, Agile Condor uses a neuromorphic architecture modeled on human neural systems. In other words, its capacity for discriminating perception is intended to mimic our own neurobiology, in contrast to typical parallel processing architecture. So unlike most machine learning image analysis that addresses entire images repeatedly, neuromorphic systems such as spiking neural network architectures are designed so that individual neurons within the system are supposed to fire independently and directly change the states of other neurons when differences between images are detected. So if you imagine like a system like this processing video image that's static over time, that holds a frame over time, it's only using energy when it detects a change in the state of the image rather than continually rescanning. Because information can be encoded directly into the signals themselves, spiking networks are also not limited to binary states and can thus, supposedly anyway, produce something closer to the analog workings of the brain. More proximate maybe to the early cybernetic dream before it veered toward an altogether different computational rationality. Now, the efficacy of these kinds of spiking neural networks remains much debated, but their promise and the articulation of them points to a kind of emerging computational tendency that doesn't neatly align with how we tend to think about these things. As with so much emergent military technology, exactly how Agile Condor might operate has to be gleaned via snippets of insight about its architecture and the machine learning techniques used in the system. A series of papers published by the research team give some indication of datasets, testing processes, and the success rate of early image recognition capacities. But as with so many technologies of future war, these technical publications give only minimal indication of how Agile Condor would work in practice. What data will it be trained on? How will it be verified and ground truthed? What information is made available back through the system without modeling and probabilities and so on? How much on-the-fly learning is the system actually capable of executing? With such questions foreclosed, we can turn instead to promotional materials for an articulation of the military imaginary that animates Agile Condor. In a 2-minute video produced by SRC Inc., Agile Condor is presented as a powerful tool for saving lives and preventing violence. Rendered in video game graphics, a General Atomics Reaper drone takes off from a mountainous Air Force base. Cruising at night above a dense urban environment, its sensor system identifies various objects, marking them with glowing green squares. Then, Agile Condor kicks in, automatically analyzing incoming imagery. Dramatized as a cliché array of image feeds entering the hardened box of the computer itself and headlined in multiple places with the term neuromorphic computing, the Agile Condor swiftly does its magic and an alert flashes. Threat detected. We cut to a swarthy figure with an RPG on his shoulder, then a convoy of vehicles and back to the aerial view. Now the convoy vehicles are marked in blue and the threat in red. The sensor pulls focus onto the threat and zooms in tight, resolving a high-resolution image that it then runs through a facial recognition system to obtain a 98% match. The convoy can be diverted and helicopters sent to arrest the would-be assailant. Sensor capture, image analysis, threat determination, geolocation, signals transfer, and operational actualization are all presented here as seamless, frictionless processes, with much of the computational work undertaken at the edge of the network, beyond the limits of human perception. Agile Condor, I think, points to the existence of a non-human witnessing operating exclusively within an algorithmic domain inaccessible to the human. This non-human witnessing occurs alongside the preemptive determinations that the system makes, diffracted through the hunt for emergent threat and within the loop of sensor capture and algorithmic identification, classification, filtering, and prioritizing. This mode of relation to the event probes the limits of witnessing. Within the broader milieu of drone warfare, any witnessing that occurs within the Agile Condor system needs to be understood in relation to its consequences for the witnessing that takes place within the wider apparatus, alongside its human actors, the image analysts and operators. If preemptive technologies such as Agile Condor seek to cut through the inefficiencies of symbolic, narrative, and causal analysis, they also undo the grounds of evidence itself by presenting the potential need for action through an operative frame, detached from the complexities of the world beyond the sensor. In a way, then, the machinic witnessing at work within the technical constellation of Agile Condor, pod, sensor array, and aerial drone constitutes a kind of witnessing without evidence. For the human operators, analysts, and commanders looped into such cybernetic control systems to varying degrees of intimacy, witnessing is already mediated by the preemptive shaping and techno-authority of the targeting system. For those operators seeing war through the machinic eye of automated imaging and analysis systems, witnessing drone violence is inescapably non-human, not only because the apparatus mediates what is captured by its sensors, but also because human witnessing is already preemptively entangled within the machine vision of Agile Condor. The final instance of non-human witnessing that I'd like to talk about can be found in the forensic architecture project Triple Chaser. Founded in 2010 by architect and academic Eyal Weizman and located at Goldsmiths at the University of London, forensic architecture invents investigative techniques using spatial, architectural, and situated methods. Presented at the 2019 Whitney Biennale in New York, Triple Chaser combines photographic images and video with synthetically generated media to develop a dataset for a deep learning neural network able to recognize tear gas canisters, like the one on the screen, used against civilians around the world and manufactured by Safariland, a company owned by former Whitney board member Warren Kanders. In keeping with the established ethos of forensic architecture, Triple Chaser demonstrates how forensics, a practice heavily associated with both policing and the law, can be turned against the very state agencies that deploy its gaze. As Joseph Pugliese points out, quote, embedded in the concept of forensic is a combination of rhetorical, performative, and narratological techniques, end quote, that can be deployed outside courts of law. For Weizman, the fora of forensics is critical. It brings evidence into the domain of contestation in which politics happens. In his agency's counter-forensic investigation into these tear gas canisters deployed by police and security agencies, the tear gas itself and its deployment and use becomes the subject of interrogation and representation to the public. In this making public, distinctions and overlaps can be traced between different modes of knowledge making and address, the production of evidence, the speaking of testimony, and the witnessing of the audience. But how might we understand the role of the machine learning algorithm itself? And how are we to conceptualize this sort of synthetic evidence? Testimony can, of course, be entered into evidence, but something more fundamental is at work in Triple Chaser. Its machine learning model doesn't simply register or represent. It's operative, generating relations between objects in the world and the parameters of its data. Its technical assemblage precedes both evidence and testimony. It engages, I think, in non-human witnessing. As development commenced, Triple Chaser faced a challenge. Forensic architecture was only able to source a small percentage of the thousands of images needed to train a machine learning algorithm to recognize the tear gas canisters produced by Safariland. They were, however, able to source detailed video footage of depleted canisters from activists, and they even obtained some material fragments themselves. Then, borrowing from strategies used by Microsoft, NVIDIA, and others, this video data could be modeled in environments built in the Unreal gaming engine and then scripted to output thousands of canister images against backgrounds ranging from abstract patterns to simulated real-world environments. Tagging of these natively digital objects also sidestepped the labor and error of manual tagging, allowing a training set to be built swiftly from images created with their metadata attached. Using several different machine learning techniques, including transfer learning, combining synthetic and real images and reverse discriminators, investigators were able to train a neural network to identify Safariland tear gas canisters from a partial image with a high degree of accuracy and with weighted probabilities of its own success. These synthetic evidence assemblages then taught the algorithm to witness. Like most image recognition systems, Triple Chaser deploys a convolutional neural network, or CNN, which learns how to
Triple Chaser branding around the world.
Let's pause that, hey. Yeah. Which learns how to spatially analyze the pixels of an image. Trained on tagged datasets, CNNs they convolve a series of filters across the surface of an image to produce activation maps that allow the algorithm to iteratively learn about the spatial arrangement of pixels, which can be repeated across large sets of images. These activation maps are passed from one convolutional layer to the next, with various techniques applied to increase accuracy and prevent the spatial scale of the system from going out of control. Exactly what happens within each convolutional layer remains in the algorithmic unknown. It cannot be distilled into representational form, but rather eludes cognition. Machine learning processes thus exhibit a kind of autonomic affective capacity to form relations between objects and build schemas for action from the modulation and mapping of those relations, what we might call machinic affect. Relations between elements vary in intensity, with the process of learning both producing and identifying intensities that are autonomous from the elements themselves. It's precisely this that cannot be visualized. Intensive relations assemble elements into new aggregations. Bodies affect and are affected by other bodies. There is an autonomic quality to such algorithmic knowledge making, one that's more affective than cognitive. This machinic registering of relations accumulates to make legible otherwise unknown connections between sensory data, and it does so with the potential, if not the intention, for that registering to make political claims, to function as a kind of witnessing of what might otherwise go undetected. As Triple Chaser demonstrates, algorithmic witnessing troubles both relations between witness and evidence and those between witnessing and event. This machine learning system, trained to witness via synthetic data sets, suggests that the linear temporal relation in which evidence, the photograph, the fragment of tear gas, is interpreted by the human witness, that this temporal relation cannot or need not hold. We don't need to have the event and then the human witness. Through their capacities for recognition and discrimination, non-human agencies of the machinic system enact the witnessing that turns the trace of events into evidence. Witnessing is, in this sense, a kind of relational diagram that makes possible the composition of relations that in turn assemble into objects that can be experienced. If witnessing precedes both evidence and witness, then witnessing forges the witness, rather than the figure of the witness, granting witnessing its legitimacy and standing. So, non-human witnessing elevates the status of the other than human. Elevates the status of the other than human in bearing witness. Refiguring witnessing as the entanglement of human and non-human entities in the making of knowledge claims. Non-human witnessing can be identified in ecological, biological, geological, and even chemical manifestations, but also in technical and aesthetic forms, such as drone sensor assemblages and machine learning algorithms. This means that non-human witnessing is inseparable from place, time, media, context, and the other human and non-human bodies through and alongside which it takes place. Against the singular world of the scientific or juridical witness inherited from the Enlightenment, Non-human witnessing coheres with what Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena call, quote, a world of many worlds. Upending the long history in theory and philosophy of reserving witnessing for the human subject, my provocation is that witnessing is and always has been non-human. Our contemporary conjuncture makes this much easier to see, precisely because so much of Western ontology and epistemology has been thrown into crisis. If crises of autonomous war, algorithmic enclosure, and environmental catastrophe are indeed converging in the contemporary moment, it is surely in no small part because their roots reach so deep into the historical ground of militarism, capitalism, and settler colonialism. Non-human witnessing thus provides purchase on unfolding catastrophic futures, but also on the catastrophes of the past, and on the potential for radical hope, historical acts of resistance, and the making and remaking of more just worlds. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for your wonderful, summary and overview of this fascinating book, Non-Human Witnessing. Before opening the floor for the discussion and receiving questions, let me briefly summarize the book's undertaking, key concept and methodologies, and a brief question. The book, I think, to summarize the book's key argument in response to the epistemic challenges posed by the various polycrises on varying scales, including algorithmic enclosure, automated warfare, and ecological catastrophe. The concept of non-human witnessing you propose brings together seemingly disparate scenes of crisis in relational and transversal manner, proposing to rethink video witnessing in non-anthropocentric analytical ways, and also of witnessing as mediation. In doing so, you depthly interweave different methodologies, including radical empiricism and Black or indigenous studies that problematize and rethink human from colonial and post-colonial perspectives, and the vitalist philosophy of Durgen Gattari, and particularly Brian Massumi, notions of onto power and effect, and Manuel Duranda, and the studies of media ecology and environmental media studies, including the wonderful works by Sean Corbett, and some new materialism led by Kevin Barrett and others, and the studies on automated and preemptive media illustrated by Mark Andreevich, and the proposal of counterforensics that reckons with modern human agent by Joseph Pugliese, and the practice and theory of material witnessing by Susan Supri and A.I. Weidman and his architecture initiative. So the biggest contribution of my book, I think, is to ask for the expansion of witnessing, or by extension, the expansion of media in general, by embracing mediations that that interacting various agents are involved in. So actually my next book, which is entitled Crisis Media, crisis media, expanding the media in the precarious 21st century, is published in December. This is only in Korean first, and from the borrowing quotation that I found from page 16, I find that this work has a lot of common points with my upcoming book, which says this vitalist understanding of mediation requires an expansive understanding of media forms, one that sees everything from crowds to youth tribes to the planet itself as media. So this is one of the sentences I like most. I definitely agree with. So after summarizing your books, key ideas, methodologies, concepts, my first question is in relation to chapter 1, where you present the idea of the concept of violent mediation in the context of the drone warfare from the early to mid 2000s, examining the Agile Condor system and the U.S. drone wars in Afghanistan and the Syrian war. So I was wondering, do you have any afterthought on the recent drone warfare that we can find from Russian-Ukrainian war or Israel-Palestinian war, including the pervasive use of the first-person drones in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the use of machine learning for targeting human victims in the Israel-Palestine war, in terms of how violent mediation has worsened or strengthened or changed it. So I was wondering about observation on the recent violent scenes of war led by drone computational strategies.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. As you can tell from the list of sort of names and different fields of theory and so on that you gave us just now, the book is reflective of my tendency to roam across different kinds of areas and bring lots of those different things together. I'm sure in ways that are not entirely satisfying at times to people who are very expert in particular ones of those areas, but hopefully are interesting in the way they come together. I'm also really excited for when your next book eventually comes out in English, because it sounds like something that
actually in Korean first.
I know first in Korean, and I think that it might take me a while to learn Korean well enough to read your book in Korean. So hopefully it will be out in English soon. It sounds fascinating. Yeah, in the book, I developed this kind of concept of violent mediation to describe the processes of mediation that are reductive, destructive, violent, limiting, radical, not necessarily all forms of abstraction, but like radically abstracting ones that involve like impositions of systems of control and so on. And I do this because I think it's important to recognize that mediation takes so many different kinds of forms. And I wanted a way to kind of differentiate some of those. And I think, as you were sort of suggested with the quote that you kindly read out, the book has a very expansive version of media and mediation at its heart. And I think this is, so many academic disciplines love to kind of work out a way for our field to be the one that can speak to everything. But I do think that media and processes of mediation are one of these things that operates across so many different kinds of domains. And so understanding how they take specific forms is really valuable. The book and was really written, the bulk of it was written sort of up through 2021, 2020 into 2022 a little bit. And so, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was really only just kicking off as I was like finishing the book. And the current war or genocide in Gaza was not yet, was very far from underway. The book came out shortly after that commenced. So there is a whole domain and a kind of evolutionary leap in the use of these types of technologies in war that's not captured in the book, although a little bit in other stuff I've been working on. I think, though, that you hit on something really important, which is that we are seeing these tendencies emerging more and more. And I think in particular, we are seeing in the real dangers of autonomous warfare are not so much in the killer robot that is like a Terminator style robot, but rather in this sort of like hybridization of the technological and the human, a kind of shift towards an increasingly kind of cyborg warfare where the machine components have their own kinds of agency and often kind of quite profoundly so, and in certain instances are coming to shape human perception and action and decision making. I think Ukraine is really interesting because a lot of the uses of drones and other kinds of technology that have garnered attention are using so-called consumer off-the-shelf drones or COTS drones. So the kinds of things that you or I could go to the DJI store and buy ourselves and quite quickly learn how to pilot. And so these things have been taken up and adapted for warfare, which in some respects, like I think speaks to the sort of endlessly creative forms of violence that war generates. Like war is a creative process. It's a terrible one, but it is creative in the sense that it generates the new. And so we've seen that in Ukraine. We've also seen a kind of insistence on witnessing war through the eye of the drone. I think in a way that has not been so much the case in other instances. So, you know, we've had images of war circulated that are video footage shot through drones as they drop munitions on Russian posts. We've seen, you know, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry releasing footage shot through the viewfinders and sensor apparatuses of the TB2, the Bayraktar drones that they purchased from Turkey. And so this is very much a war that has been mediated through the eye of the drone in a much more deliberate, concerted, and popularized a distributed way than the American conflicts that brought the drone to prominence, where drone footage was very much sealed off and controlled and so on. And so I think part of the shift there is not just in what's happening on the battlefield, but the way that imagery is being distributed and used to shape what the war is and how it's understood. And so I think that's super interesting, and I'm actually doing a little bit of a collaborative project using some machine learning systems and stuff to kind of try and understand and track that. I think that what's happening in Gaza and in Israel's use of automated targeting systems is slightly different in the sense that they're very different kinds of systems, and what they are doing, I think, is sort of on the very scary end of what we might have anticipated about the developments in warfare, where the problem seems not, in fact, to be a lack of humans involved in the process. The problem is the deferral of the human to the automated system. And so the automated systems, you know, there's been a lot of investigative reporting on these systems from 972 plus the sort of anti-war Israeli investigative magazine, particularly on some systems called Lavender and Gospel, which are automated target generation systems. So they don't pull the trigger, right? But they do the work of understanding the world, of composing the targets, of suggesting and recommending them. In many ways, they are the witnesses to threat. They are the ones who are constructing a relation in which life is at stake. And then those targets are proposed to human operators. And now in the kind of thinking about how these human-machine relations are supposed to work, humans are supposed to be the sober sources of judgment, where like human judgment steps in and says like, well, you know, how do we really know this? What is the machine's basis for determining this, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, that's not what's happening at all. And in fact, it generates targets so fast that the human operators can't keep up. And so by all reports, they are deferring always to the machine. And so then we have like incredible forms of aerial destruction taking place where the human agents, the human witnesses, the human overseers and supervisors are actually in no position to bear witness to that violence. And so if we are to understand that violence, we have to work out some way to call the systems to account. And I don't think that is through granting them the same agency that humans have and demanding that they appear in a court and justify themselves or something, but it is in recognizing that these are knowledge-making machines, and we have to reckon very seriously with that. What the solution is, I'm not sure, but I think you've hit on like this very important shift that's happened in the last couple of years.
Thank you for your wonderful, answer. So, so I'm gonna open the floor for your questions and discussions. So you may, turn your the video on and pose your question, or you can also pitch your question or comment on the chat box of the right side of the screen, either in English or in Korean. For the latter, I'm gonna translate it into English for Michael, and and keep on a discussion.
While people are thinking, I was really interested, in reading parts of your work, Jihyun, about this kind of expanded domain of documentary and the way you sort of situate forensic architecture's work, for example, in a kind of documentary tradition. And that was really interesting to me because and also too, you write in that book about Errol Morris's film Standard Operating Procedure, which is something I wrote about in my first book as well. So I found these like really interesting synergies between the things that we've been thinking about, but the way you trace that through documentary traditions and their kind of insistence on a kind of testimonial function, right? Was really interesting to me, and I guess I'm kind of like curious about what you think about like the shift, say, in forensic architecture's work to start to adopt more automated systems themselves and what that does to documentary.
I think that's one of the kind of questions that I've been thinking. It's actually not about documentary itself, but also the changing status of epistemic and ontological assumption about the truthful image or the indexed image in general. So my idea is that with the growing dominance of the computer vision and the recent, proliferation of synthetic media or triggered by the boom of generative AI, the notion of the traditional indexicality has been under threat. But at the same time, I think that it also allows us to rethink the idea of truth claims or indexicality in more combinatory or rational ways, so that we are not, no longer, solely dependent on the correspondence between image and reference. We have to think about the broader interconnection of, different, technical and legal or, powerful agent concerned with the production and dissemination of truth. So, so as you, discuss in the example of, the New York-based, Buick-based, the activist agency, the witness, the development of the verification, tools for, the deepfake and the, fakery synthetic, document demonstrate that we need to think about the collaboratory method for, the verifying what truthful image is and how the truth notion of truth is changed and reconstructed and reconfigured. So this means that not only the idea of indexicality itself, but also the documentary media are changing with these technological challenges. So So I actually completed a paper and submitted a journal. It is about how the idea of Bruno Latour's compositionism enabled us to rethink the idea of documentary media based with its external and internal crisis. The external crisis means a variety of pre-crises that many the many institutions or artists are dealing with. In the case, as in case of foreign architecture, the poly-ecological or political the crisis that you are also discussing in your book, and the internal crisis pertain to the crisis posed by the technological or material the constitution components of components of previous documentary media, as evidenced by the deep neural network and the synthetic AI. So actually, another question that I have in mind is actually this. I think this this is the question that many others who are attending here may have. How the idea of non-human witnessing relates to the victim perpetrator dynamics traditionally applied to the state studies on the trauma witnessing and testimony, the heavily loaded concepts that were previously associated with our anthropocentric assumption about assumptions. So yeah, so because because
It's a great
because your book, Deputy, like you said, in the introduction of a talk, stem from your literary background and your engagement with trauma studies.
Yeah, I mean, in kind of all my work since my PhD research through to now, I've been very driven by a relational understanding of phenomena in the world, including trauma, which I've always understood as something that is relational. It's about severing and disrupting of relations between the body and the world. But also by if you take seriously that question of relationality, whether it applies to trauma or to witnessing or to experience more generally, then you are also accepting that there's not a clear and fundamental boundary to the body, that our existence in the world is bound up with the situations that we're in, the encounters that we're taking place, the kind of Deleuzian notion of a kind of ongoing becoming, and continual reforming. And so to me, if we take that seriously through the ways we think and approach what theory can do and what thought can do, then we have to be willing to kind of dissolve the boundaries of various things when what they do rubs up against the world and the stuff that we want to understand. And so, I think in relation to witnessing, for example, the book and throughout the talk, I mostly use that gerund form of witnessing, not the witness or to bear witness or testimony, because the book is like primarily concerned with how it is that witnessing takes place once we how it is that witnessing takes place, and the non-human comes in because my sense is that so much of it is not actually bound to human perception and human subjectivity. Part of that, though, and the kind of one of the things that the kind of political propositions that animates the book as well, to some extent, is that witnessing and the human have always had a very uneasy and complicated relationship, actually, and that the capacity to bear witness, whether that is in a court or within a cultural context or within a kind of political domain, has not always been evenly distributed. And in fact, like in many instances, whether or not one is able to bear witness is a marker of one's humanity or lack of humanity. And so, one of the key examples of this is, during the era of the slave trade in the United States, where enslaved people were not accorded the capacity to bear witness. They did not have the same standing before the courts as free white people did. And so, like, whether or not one could bear witness in court was actually like a marker of humanity. And so, and you can trace back other versions of that, where who is able to bear witness and who is not able is a deeply contested and political thing. And so, witnessing as a concept and the witness as a particular figure has done significant violence over history. And one form that takes is in the kind of collapse of the figure of the witness into the kind of Enlightenment figure of man who is able to speak truth, do science, propose philosophy, etc., and who kind of in this sort of European figure comes to kind of stand in for the human around the world in a way that is like actually at odds with the experience of so many cultures and the way many places have understood what it means to be human or otherwise. And so part of the kind of proposition of the book is to say, hang on a second, like, this assumption that the human and the witness sit easily together is actually problematic. And when we do that, and we kind of allied a whole host of violences that take place and fail to recognize that witnessing has been an anti-human practice or a dehumanizing practice in many instances.
Yeah, thank you. So I can see in the checkbox, a question kindly posed by Rameri Mukherjee. So what is your take on non-human animal witnessing in this entire schema of discussion? They too are at the receiving end of capitalism and colonialism. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great question, Rumali. Thank you. I am not well versed in kind of animal studies as a field, and as hopefully has been clear, there's like many fields converging in this book, and that was one area that I just couldn't kind of bring in actively and in a direct way. But my feeling is that non-human animals are actually like vital witnesses to the transformations of the world around us, and in fact, we would do well to consider how we might reckon with the witnessing capacity of animals in sort of understanding the moment that we're in and the places that we've come from. In some ways, like non-human animals can't necessarily speak in the same way that human animals can. And so, in many instances, like non-human animals require someone to speak on their behalf, or they require very close attention to the ways that they bear witness that are not verbal, that might be about attending to transformations of ways of living and being in the world, or perhaps changes in the way animals move and occupy space. And so I think, like, for me, animality very much exists in that kind of ecological domain, which is a domain of all life, of course. And so, yeah, as you say, they're very much at the receiving end of capitalism and colonialism as well. And I think it in many ways, could be thought through or engaged with through this kind of framework too. But it's not something that I've had real opportunity to get into myself.
All right, thank you. So another question can be found in the chat box, which is kindly posed by Dr. Nara Lee, a member of the center's external advisory board. She said, "Thank you for your presentation. The concept of non-human witnessing is incredibly fascinating. you mentioned the violence of fixed concept of testimony and witness, but I would like to ask a follow-up question. A witness is typically understood as someone who passively experiences tragedies or disasters. The power of testimony lies in the transformative process where a passive being becomes an active voice or agency. By proposing the concept of a non-human witness, are you suggesting that agency is not central to testimony? If not, does this imply that the presence of the non-human is inherently active? Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. It's a really difficult one, and there's not, I think, an easy answer. I would say, sort of before I address the question directly, that I tend to think that the lines between what constitutes witnessing versus not witnessing, or say witnessing and perceiving, or between testimony and speech and so on, are always blurry and difficult to delineate in any particular way. I think that we need to think of these things as like continuums, or perhaps as spectrums, or maybe even like one can occupy multiple versions of these positions at the same time, dependent on context. And sometimes the determination of when witnessing takes place or who gets to be the witness is something that occurs after the event rather than in the midst of it. I think you're right that we often understand the witness as someone who passively experiences, but I also think we can think of witnesses not just as a bystander in this sense, but like witnesses can be perpetrators, witnesses can be victims, witnesses can be survivors, witnesses can be the dead. And so I think that it's true that you're right about where the transformative power of testimony lies. Certainly like an active voice, or if we take voice and expand it out, not just to be speech, but to be capacities for expression or communication, then like, yes, certainly there is this kind of like activity. So for me, that's where it kind of comes back to where your like two pairs of questions at the end are that agency is not central to testimony. No, I think agency is central to testimony, but I do think that that there is agency in the world that far exceeds the human, and that communication and communicative agency and communicative relations are not bound up necessarily with the human. And so I do think that like agency matters, and I think in particular kind of communicative agency matters, but I don't think it can be kind of reduced to the position of the human. And in fact, this kind of my proposition is like let's open up the space for even just provisionally and say like, what might it mean if we accepted that witnessing was going on all around us in many different forms and through many different processes and objects and agencies and ecologies and non-human animals and systems of mediation and so on. And so if that witnessing is taking place, how is it that we might attend to its testimony, right? And in some ways, like the book is about that, mostly about that first part of like attending to the agency. The question of like, what do we do with the testimony? How do we mobilize that into a kind of meaningful politics and so on, is something that I kind of try to talk about a little bit in the kind of conclusion to the book. But it is maybe something that the kind of questions that you're asking prompt further research or further discussion, and are exactly the kinds of things that I think we need to be considering, and that I hope it's the kind of discussion that the book produces.
All right. Yeah, there's been a wonderful and rich, discussion, but actually, in EST, the time is approaching midnight. So, I'm sorry that it's time for us to let Michael go for the next day. And but definitely, it was a very pleasant moment for you to give us your wonderful talk and engage the discussion after that. So let us big applause to Michael for his work that cherishes our inaugural colloquium event.
Thank you so much, Jihoon, and thank you again for the deep honor of this invitation and the chance to give this talk. I'm humbled and thrilled.
Yeah, thank you. And before the closing this room, so let me briefly give us a trailer for the center's upcoming event on April 25th. We'll have the first CCMS platform event with the KBS producer Lee Tae-woong, who has been taking the leading role for the modern Korea documentary series. He will be in person to introduce his methodologies and ideas of his wonderful compilation documentary 남아지는 mixtape. And for the second colloquium event, we'll host Rick Warner from UNC Chapel Hill with his wonderful book, The Reverse of Suspense, published by Columbia University Press in last year. So please stay tuned for those next events by joining our mailing list or following us on our social media, whose link you can find from the website CAU-CCMS.com for more details. But thank you for all of you for your attending, and have a great night or have a great evening and or evening or afternoon, and we're gonna see you in the in our next event. Thank you, Michael, once again.